Welcome back to the 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association, and welcome to our new podcast studio here in downtown Washington, D.C. We're at the Podville Media headquarters, and it's very exciting to begin this next step with our podcast for the 60th episode during the White House Historical Association's 60th year. I'd like to extend a special word of thanks to John Rogers, Vice Chair of our Board of Directors, for his very generous support of this podcast. The White House is the ceremonial stage upon which our nation welcomes our most important visitors from across the country and around the world. For some people, these events are the first time that they've had the opportunity to actually visit the White House and see the incredible art, architecture, and furnishings of the Executive Mansion. This experience is often true for visiting heads of state who are welcomed with an arrival ceremony on the South Lawn. Perhaps this is where you are most familiar with seeing the United States Army's Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. But these women and men have a long history of playing at the White House for global audiences. Today, I'm joined by Sergeant Major Mark Riley, who leads the Fife and Drum Corps, and Sergeant Major Billy White, who was the Operations Sergeant Major for this year's inaugural committee for President Biden. Welcome, Sergeant Major Riley and Sergeant Major White. It's terrific to be with you today.
Thank you for having us.
Great. Well, let's dive right in. I'm really excited about this topic that we're going to discuss, and I believe that our followers will as well. Tell us how the U.S. Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps got its beginning.
Absolutely. Stuart, first off, I'm humbled to be here. But in 1960, it was General Order 18, and Billy will also help me here with this as well, because different details, some are folklore and some are captured in documents. But each of the services have a type of traditional musical unit, from a bagpipe group with the Air Force to the Drum and Bugle Corps with the Marines. And the Army wanted to capture something that was a little bit different from the Drum and Bugle Corps, as well as capture the tradition of the Army and field music. So in 1960, we created the Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps.
So this was founded during the end of the Eisenhower presidency.
That is correct. And as a matter of fact, we've got a photo from very late in President Eisenhower's second administration of the first year of the Fife and Drum Corps leading him in a convertible to the parade field at Fort Myer.
When it was begun in 1960, what was the mission? What was it envisioned that it would be doing? And is it the members of this unit, is this their full-time job in the Army to perform?
So the mission of the Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps is to support Department of the Army and Department of Defense retirement ceremonies and special events at the White House and at the Pentagon. That started maybe a little bit differently in 1960 because each of the members of the Corps were the Infantry 11 Bravo MOS. So they were trained to really just start learning how to play on the instrument, how to march with the instrument. And so there were very different stories that came out at the very beginning of what the mission was going to be. And the organization was actually almost cut 2 or 3 times at the very beginning. But I know Billy's got a great story about a birthday song at the very beginning.
Well, the Corps starts out as a very functional organization. They were instituted to help train the Old Guard to march. So providing a unit that could provide music to help the Old Guard practice its marching. And it was decided shortly after the Corps was formed that it was a marginal activity. Those were the words that were used, a marginal activity and not worth continuing funding. The lieutenant who was in charge of the Fife and Drum Corps at the time, his name was Henry Watson, eventually became a brigadier general. He found out about this and understood that it was Wilbur Brucker's birthday the next day. Wilbur Brucker at the time was the Secretary of the Army, and he had housing on Fort Myer. So the next morning, Lieutenant Watson has the Fife and Drum Corps arrayed in front of Secretary Brucker's home on Fort Myer. And he was woken to the sounds of fifes and drums playing Happy Birthday. By the end of the week, the Fife and Drum Corps had funding for new uniforms and new instruments.
Wow, that was pretty strategic.
We haven't stopped since.
That's great. Well, let's go back. The Fife and Drum Corps was begun in 1960, but the Old Guard itself, which this is a part of, has a much longer history than that. Billy, tell us about that.
Indeed. So the Old Guard is the Army's oldest active duty infantry regiment still serving today. Founded in 1784 in order to provide a force capable of responding to any emergencies that the nation needed. Up until that point, the Army had been little more than a company stationed at West Point with an element of fife and drum, but that small element at West Point to guard the arsenal at West Point. So the first engagements that the Old Guard was involved in were part of the early, what are now referred to as Indian Wars. The force was sent out to protect settlers who were moving further and further west into Ohio, western Pennsylvania, and what we now call the Midwest.
So what are the units that comprise the overall Old Guard? You're one of them. What are the others?
Sure. Some very famous units are part of the Old Guard. You have the U.S. Army Drill Team. You have the caisson platoon that brings the horse-drawn caissons into Arlington National Cemetery. The Continental Color Guard is seen at major sporting events such as the Super Bowl or the All-Star Game. Then you have the Fife and Drum Corps, which is very unique in itself because it came from infantry at the very beginning, and now we have some of the most classically trained and decorated musicians that are on the planet.
So we're hearing this wonderful new set, but I'm sad to say that these beautiful elements are not a permanent part of our set. This is actually a drum, a fife, and a bugle that you brought this morning, the instruments of the Fife and Drum Corps. Tell us the history and the story behind these instruments.
Sure thing. So this is a rope tension American-style snare drum. It actually is tensioned by rope, so the heads and the rim and everything are actually kept together and made taut through the rope. And these pieces down here called ears. So these leather ears are what actually tune the instrument. And this would have been very similar to the instruments used at the end of the 18th century and early 19th century. The background of blue with the eagle here is the regimental colors. This would have been on the battle flag of the 3rd Infantry going back to its earliest days. And here we see different elements of the Old Guard. So you have a presidential eagle, you have the tri-cornered hat here. Noli me tangere means touch me not in Latin. And then on the sides here, we have all of the battle honors or streamers that the Old Guard would have participated in throughout its history. So going all the way back from the Seminole Wars to modern day Iraq.
So Mark, you told us great detail about the drum. You're a drummer. Billy, tell us about the fife and the bugle.
The fife and bugle, like the drum, are both signaling instruments with long histories in the military. The fife was first used in Switzerland during the 14th century, traveled throughout Europe with Swiss mercenaries, and then eventually makes the leap to North America with the French and British armies during what we refer to as the French and Indian War. The bugle would originally have been a trumpet, a little bit larger than what you see here today, used in the American military as early as the American Revolution. As a matter of fact, Congress authorized trumpeters and drummers for the Continental Army. Didn't authorize fifers, but fifes were easier to come by than trumpets, and so you ended up with fifers in the Army as well. Bugles become much more prominent during the 19th century, specifically used with cavalry regiments because they're much easier to use on horseback. Both instruments, along with the drum, continued to be used in that functional role, providing signals and instructions to soldiers all the way up until the eve of World War II, when radio communications really came into its own and finally supplanted music as the main mechanism for communicating over long distances.
That's really incredible. And of course, the tri-corner hat that's on top and the imagery that will be shown of the members of the unit playing, you'll see the red coats.
Right. Exactly.
And I imagine there's a lot of questions you get about the red coats because to most Americans, that represents the British.
Sure. So the question about the red coat comes up all the time for obvious reasons. Fifers and drummers in the 18th century, the custom was to wear the opposite color that your parent unit wore. So once George Washington established blue coats with red facings as the primary unit or uniform for the Continental Army, the fifers and drummers in an ideal situation would have been clothed in a red coat with blue facings, which is what we wear. We all know realistically that funding for the Army during the American Revolution wasn't quite what the funding for the Army is today. The reality of the number of fifers and drummers that we have being all clad in the same uniform is pretty slim. But we have the luxury of representing the ideal situation as opposed to the reality, since we're not a reenactment unit.
Would the British have had the reverse, the red coat for the military, the fighting force, and the blue for their drummers?
Indeed. So in a lot of art from the 18th century, you'll see British fifers and drummers, and they're often wearing white coats or yellow coats, depending on the color of the facing. That's the border color of the regimental coat for the regiment they're attached to, which is often white or yellow in the British Army of the time.
So I was at Fort Myer last week, and we have some outtakes from my visit there. So why don't we take a look at some of that? Tell us about the other elements of the Old Guard that are out here rehearsing this morning. How do they interface with your group?
Absolutely. So the primary mission of the Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps is to continue the musical heritage from the founding of our nation. But we also have secondary duties, and the secondary duties really showed itself during 9/11. We became part of the communications team here, the manifest team of trying to control what type of people would come onto the installation and what type of people would come off of the installation. Here, this is our second duty and tertiary duty, where we are training the troops on how to march in the Old Guard fashion. So the Old Guard being the oldest active duty infantry regiment, starting in 1784, we have a very different style of marching than the typical Army unit. So here, these are all new soldiers that are coming from a private all the way to a colonel, and they have to learn the Old Guard style of marching, and they play this drum beat just to keep the marching style going.
So this land where we're standing here is Fort Myer, and we're just across the Potomac River from Washington. What's the history of Fort Myer and its meaning to the United States Army?
It's actually a great question. So this is originally called Fort Whipple, and it was part of the Arlington Line during the American Civil War, which basically there were cannonades that were here protecting Washington from the Confederate Army. This field here is actually the first air flight for the Army as well. So the Wright brothers came here on this field and had the first flight. They actually, unfortunately, had the first aviation death in military history as well.
So the Wright brothers were right here on this parade field where we are this morning.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Let's talk about the two of you and how you began your storied histories as a part of this unit. Mark?
I'm originally from upstate New York. My parents are from the Bronx, and so when they decided to move out of the city to have a more conducive life for children, they decided to enroll me into a fife and drum corps at the age of 6. So I had some friends that were a part of the local Young Fusiliers Fife and Drum Corps from Millbrook, New York. And so I did my first parade carrying the American flag with my Cub Scout uniform, but later joined a competitive Fife and Drum Corps called the Young Colonials. And so as I graduated high school, I went to undergraduate school in Northwestern State University of Louisiana and received my degree in music education. I was going to be a band director, was very happy with that path in Dallas, Texas. And years went by, and a good friend of mine had just received a slot with the Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps as a snare drummer. And so anytime that the Corps would be performing in San Antonio or Chicago or things like that, I'd receive a phone call and he'd say, "Come on, Mark, you got to join, you got to join." And so 20 years later, I never thought in a million years I would have a career performing as a professional musician, serving my country, playing at the White House. It truly has been an honor.
Billy, tell us your story.
Sure. I grew up in Williamsburg, Virginia. Spent my childhood in the museum at Colonial Williamsburg as a member of the Fife and Drum Corps there. My father had been in the Fife and Drum Corps before me. My brother was in the Corps after I was. I started learning to play the fife from my father when I was 7, and then joined that Corps at age 10. When I graduated from the Colonial Williamsburg Corps and graduated from high school, I went to James Madison University to study music, like Mark, just different college. And studying music at James Madison, my flute professor knew about my background with fife and drum and saw a vacancy notice for the Old Guard and recommended that I take the audition. So I did, and I came to the Fife Drum Corps in April of 1994 and retired last month.
Quite a career. Congratulations.
Thank you.
How does someone become a member? Do they just apply? Do they go online? Do they audition? How does it work?
So there'll be an announcement that a slot will be open about usually 90 to 120 days out. They'll set the date for a live audition, but you have to make it through the video round first. So someone has to send in a video, you have to play certain excerpts of music, and then usually a prepared solo piece that shows your virtuosity. So once you make it through the video round, based on how many openings, that's how many folks we bring in for the live 2-day audition, which is marching, playing and marching, playing with the ensemble. We even include a standing test because a lot of our job is standing out for retirement ceremonies. So we have to make sure that people can have the standing endurance that we need to have. And so typically anywhere between 20 to 45 applicants will send a video in. And we usually take between 6 and 12 to the on-site for one slot.
I want to talk about 3 events that are perhaps the most highly visible events that your unit will take part in. Those would be the state arrival ceremonies on the south lawn of the White House, the inaugural parade that occurs every 4 years, and then, of course, the state funerals, where a current or former president of the United States will have a ceremonial funeral, a state funeral in their honor. Billy, I understand that you were involved in the inaugural parade this year and perhaps several others. Tell us how that process begins and what all goes into that planning, preparation, and execution.
The Military District of Washington has been planning in the background for at least 2 years before August of the year prior to the inauguration parade. In August, they begin bringing additional personnel into the Military District of Washington to increase the staff size to cover all of the myriad of requirements that have to happen. For the Fife and Drum Corps, specifically, we start training for the inaugural parade. Just one parade, march straight down the street. There's not a whole lot to it. But we start training for that in October. So we give it a good 4 to 5 months of dedicated training time to make sure that when we show up on the Capitol Plaza, it's the best performance that we can possibly provide.
And do you have a chance to have a live rehearsal on the?
We do. The Sunday before the inauguration, every year, the Military Honor Guard reenacts in advance the parade route, and we'll do the pass and review at the Capitol building, which is the official transfer, the first time that the new president receives military honors. And then we'll lead the parade down the parade route past the White House. There's always a stand-in for the president, the first lady, the vice president.
Because they will not have arrived at the reviewing stand at that
Exactly.
point.
So there's always 4 lucky individuals from the Military District of Washington who get to stand in and be the president or one of the other dignitaries for the day. And they have the truly unique honor of being honored by the Military Honor Guard.
Oh, that's really terrific.
As a stand-in for the president.
State arrival ceremonies on the South Lawn, very highly visible, intricately organized events. Who gets the call that one is going to happen, and then what takes place between that point and the time of the event?
Right. So optimally, you would hope that you have a few months' notice to prepare. Often that's not the case. So you have to have these rehearsals trained months in advance. So even when we bring new soldiers into the Fife and Drum Corps, they're trained on that ceremony sequence almost from the very beginning, because that's when the money is made. That is when we have to be perfect. We have to be on point. So in a perfect world scenario, you would have the con-op or concept of operations would be sent down. There'd be a date attached. There'd be a dignitary and a name also attached. So you can have the proper flags, you can have the proper national anthem, those types of things that take place. And so to go back to Fort Myer and the Summerall Field, which is our parade ground, a few weeks earlier, what we would end up doing is setting up that parade ground to look as close as we possibly can make it to the south lawn of the White House, with stanchions and marks and a kind of mock-up reviewing stand. So those are very unique opportunities where if a guest gets to see or be a part of that as an audience member, they're seeing a piece of military and American history, full stop, where you're seeing the Fife and Drum Corps, you're seeing another one of the rotating military bands that's there as well, but you're seeing the honor guards of all the services. And so that does take a lot of coordination. And that's one of the unique pieces also with the Fife and Drum Corps, is that we are a permanent party in Washington. So we do our entire career here, where all of the other folks in all of the honor guards are going to do a 2 to 3 year stint. So they do rely on the Fife and Drum Corps to be the piece of continuity for arrivals, for state funerals, and of course the inauguration.
For those events, do you insert music or take music out based on who the dignitary may be?
Funniest story I think I've been a part of for a state arrival was when Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II came to Washington. I think she also visited the Kentucky Derby on that trip. But the tradition is that we will do a troop step, which is the honor step to honor the White House, honor the dignitary, and also honor the president. And so at the end of the troop step, we always go into Yankee Doodle. That is the kind of theme song of early America and the Fife and Drum Corps. But we found that it would be pretty disrespectful to play Yankee Doodle for Her Majesty. And so we rehearsed British Grenadiers. And in my 20 years of the Fife and Drum Corps, that is the only time we've ever changed from Yankee Doodle to any other tune.
That's a great story. Well, state funerals are events that occur often without much notice. So you have to be ready and prepared. I believe there's a 5-day countdown from the time of death until the actual ceremony that takes place, often at Washington National Cathedral. The current president, all living former presidents, I understand, have a plan in place that's reviewed from time to time. How do you rehearse those and anticipate those funerals and keep track of what the different plans are for each president? And then when one of those occasions arises, what do you do? How do you get ready?
In 2004, when President Reagan passed away, it had been 10 years since the last state funeral. And as Mark mentioned, the personnel that come through the Washington, D.C. honor guards are temporary. They're here for 2 to 3 years at least. So there was nobody in the area that had institutional knowledge that remembered Richard Nixon's state funeral. After every military operation, there's what's called an after-action review. And one of the outcomes from that after-action review for President Reagan's funeral was that we needed to have a better plan in place to provide continuity and make sure that we were prepared for a state funeral, if it's another decade before the next one. And as Mark mentioned, the Fife and Drum Corps is that continuity piece for the Old Guard. And since the Army is the senior service for all the honor guards in the area, the Old Guard has taken charge of state funeral planning since President Reagan's funeral.
Let's go back in history a little bit. If George Washington were to be an invited guest on the Truman balcony at a state arrival ceremony, and he would see your unit there, would it be perfectly familiar to him? Would he recognize it? Would there be elements that would be odd or unusual to him?
Oh, he would certainly recognize it. George Washington was the first commander of the Army, as everyone knows. And he was intimately involved in everything that had to happen to create this Continental Army, to include providing instructions for when the fifers and drummers should rehearse, what they should rehearse, what they should perform for certain ceremonial functions that happen throughout the day. He was a detail-oriented kind of guy. So if he were on the Truman balcony, I have no doubt he would look down on the Fife and Drum Corps with a critical eye. I think he would be pleased with what he saw, though.
I would hope so.
I love it. Yeah, because when you discuss the ideas of the fife and the drum as a signaling instrument, his commanders underneath him would have had to have relayed those commands to the musicians to actually relay what movements would need to happen. So when you look at the state arrival and you look at the large group of fifers and drummers that are out there and buglers, that would have been traditionally called the Corps of Drums. And so each company within inside of an infantry regiment would be assigned one fifer and one drummer. But when there would be a regimental parade, all the company's fifers and drummers would be amassed for the regimental parade. So that history piece that we see on the south lawn of the White House is a representation of that regimental parade, seeing the trooping of the soldiers going in front of the dignitary.
This is not only an entertainment unit. There's a historically functional role that these instruments had on the battlefield. Explain that.
Absolutely. So these were signaling instruments, and it goes back to 14th and 15th century Europe, where these beatings on the drum, if I played right, right, left, left, that had meaning. That could mean flank, that could mean retreat, could be reveille. And so when we look at these instruments from a functional point of view, it was the alarm clock. It was the sounding board for the commander and their troops. So if you heard reveille in the morning, that was your alarm clock to wake up. There's a piece called Tattoo, Do Dun Tap Toe, which was actually the signal for the innkeepers and tavern keepers to turn off the beer taps. So these signals that were there were really functional. They turned into what we call today the rudiments of drumming. And that structure that the military created actually did go into the education system of the United States, where these lessons or these rudiments then taught the next generation. So when you think about the Army and the idea of the Army creating systems and processes, music is still a very big part of that. And the systems that the Army created for music, you can still see today.
Well, Mark, you mentioned music education, and education is a key part of our work, teaching and telling the stories of the White House and its history going back to 1792 when George Washington selected that plot of land upon which the White House sits today. But your passion for education and conveying the history of this to young people who may hear you perform, tell us what's meaningful to you about that.
I mean, not to go too deep on this, but I had a favorite grandfather who I knew was an Army Ranger during World War II. He passed away very early on in my life. Shortly after that, I was very lucky to have a mentor named Nick Antanasio, a drummer from Brooklyn, New York. He stepped in as my surrogate kind of grandfather figure at that time. When I graduated from college, my mother handed me a pair of drumsticks. I said, "These must be from Nick." She goes, "No, these are actually from my father." And I couldn't believe it, but my father was a snare drummer in an American Legion post out of the South Bronx in the 1930s. So at that point, I kind of recognized that I had a purpose, I had a role to play kind of in this story. And I can never replace the feeling I get when I see a child pick up a pair of drumsticks and the light bulb goes off. And I speak about this often, that 2 pieces of wood can do more for a young child than almost anything in the world. So this basic, being able to play music, to be able to, use the Army as a career and then take that as a platform and say, look, I came from really a small town in New York, and through these drumsticks and dedication and practice and just determination, we can really change the world one child at a time. And that's where I feel the mission of the White House Historical Association and this partnership has been critical. It's been inspiring. And honestly, I'm quite excited to see what happens next.
Well, leading that parade is the drum major.
Mm-hmm.
And I had an interesting visit, really nice visit with the current drum major. And there's the hat and the, what is he?
Espontoon.
Yes. Tell us about the significance of those.
Well, the drum major was traditionally the most proficient, the most senior drummer. That's where the title drum major actually comes from. Our drum major is kind of the standard bearer for marching and for ceremonial excellence. They're the person that leads all of the training that the Fife and Drum Corps does to make sure that we're prepared for our performances. The S-Bon-Tune that our drum major carries, sadly, I have to say, is a little bit of a construct from the 1960s. That would not be what a drum major would have carried in the 18th century. A drum major in the 18th century would have more than likely either been carrying his own drum and sticks, or perhaps a staff about 2 to 3 feet long. Not quite the imposing spear that our S-Bon-Tune appears to be. But as the Fife and Drum Corps was constructed in the 1960s, because we're not a reenactment unit, we had the latitude to draw from a myriad of traditions. And rather than using the mace that's become the tradition of most bands, they chose an officer's weapon from the 18th century so that we would have that little bit of additional distinction, as if wearing the red coats isn't distinct enough.
And the distinction of the hat that the drum major wears?
The hat is a light infantry cap from the 18th century. So that's what your elite soldiers of the 18th century Continental Army would have worn. Those are the soldiers, for example, Washington's Life Guard, his personal unit that was his bodyguard. By the end of the war, they wore light infantry caps as well. So it's a leather shell. When you strip the bear fur off of it, it doesn't look much different than a 21st century baseball cap, except it's made out of leather and a lot less comfortable, with the bear fur arcing over the top of it. It's very distinctive.
Well, Mark, you mentioned a partnership that we have, and we love to connect with various elements of the White House, those who are there all the time and those who are just there part-time. We have a great collaboration with the White House Military Social Aids. With you, of course, this fall, we're going to launch a line of products where we'll have elements of the Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. Thank you for your leadership in helping arrange that. But I think everyone who listens to this program, watches this program, receives our catalog this fall will want to have one of those elements. There will be included what we would call a romance card that tells the story of this unit and its history. So we're very grateful to you for that opportunity and the privilege of sharing with others more widely than this program the history of your particular unit. As we wrap up, I'd just like for each of you to summarize what the experience of affiliation with this historic unit means to you personally, and any special memory that you have about your time in this service. Billy?
Having just retired a month ago, I've given this quite a lot of thought over the last several months. I never expected when I joined the Fife and Drum Corps in 1994 to make a career of it. I planned to do an enlistment and then move on. I thought when I graduated from high school, I was done with Fife and Drum. When I came to the Old Guard, I found an outlet for Fife and Drum Corps. I found a purpose for Fife and Drum Corps that I didn't understand existed before. And the opportunity to travel the country, to travel abroad and represent our country, has been the honor of a lifetime.
Mark?
I echo Billy in his comments. I have to do a lot of reading on Army regulations and things of that nature, and I came across a document called ATP 1-19, and it specifically talked about the musician's role in the Army as a cultural ambassador, and that band members are the subject matter experts when it needs to come down to cultural diplomacy. And I feel that that is something I am beyond humbled to be even a small piece of that story in the entire history and lineage of the Old Guard. But when we do these performances and we perform for veterans and we perform for first responders and their families, and you look them in the eyes and you can see that spirit and that pride and the honor that we are representing them and being a voice for them through the arts. There is nothing more that I could have ever dreamed. I even sit here now getting chills down my leg thinking about it. That it's beyond humbling. It's an honor, and I am so excited to see the next generation of Old Guard members take the mantle and lead this organization.
So before I close our program today, I have one thing that we are not prepared to do. If I were to give one of you this fife, could you play something for us?
Of course.
Okay, here we go.
Any requests?
Let's see. Let's do Yankee Doodle.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And
You're
thank
very
you,
welcome.
everyone, for watching us. This has been extraordinary. You can learn more about the White House Historical Association through our website, whitehousehistory.org. You can learn more about the Fife and Drum Corps, where?
On our Facebook and social media channels, Facebook and Instagram.
That's terrific. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you next time at the 1600 sessions. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.